The chief surgeon was already shouting when Mara Ellis reached the trauma bay, and nobody in the emergency room seemed willing to look directly at her. Her right prosthetic leg had caught against the edge of a rolling equipment cart, sending a sharp metallic scrape across the floor, and for one humiliating second she had to steady herself against the wall while a trauma team rushed around her. Dr. Adrian Cole turned from the patient and stared. He was the kind of surgeon whose silence could make an entire room straighten its posture, and now his expression hardened as he looked from Mara to the clock above the trauma doors. "You are late," he said. Mara swallowed, adjusted the strap beneath her navy scrubs, and answered that she had been assisting with another patient. Dr. Cole did not raise his voice. Somehow that made it worse. He told her that emergencies did not wait for anyone, and if she could not keep pace, she needed to leave the floor. Several nurses lowered their eyes. Nobody laughed. Nobody defended her. Mara simply nodded and stepped toward the supply cabinet. She had learned long ago that humiliation became easier to survive when it was not given an audience. The emergency department was overflowing that morning. Rain had flooded several roads, a highway collision had sent multiple injured people toward the hospital, and every available bed was occupied. Monitors chirped from behind half-drawn curtains. Rubber saws squeaked across the polished floor. The sharp smell of disinfectant mixed with coffee, antiseptic wipes, and the faint metallic scent that always seemed to follow a busy trauma unit. Mara moved carefully but quickly. Her gait was not obvious unless someone was watching for it, but she could feel every uneven step. The prosthetic had been fitted well, yet after hours on her feet it pressed painfully against the scar tissue beneath her skin. She ignored it. She always did. She had spent too many years learning that people notice weakness before they noticed effort. At 27, she was older than most interns in her program, and she carried herself with a quiet seriousness that sometimes made people forget she was still learning. She kept her hair pinned tightly behind her head, wore plain black shoes, and carried a small notebook filled with handwritten observations. She never talked about the accident. She never explained why she had chosen emergency nursing. She simply worked. A few minutes later, another ambulance arrived. The doors burst open and paramedics wheeled in a middle-aged man whose breathing was shallow and irregular. His clothing was soaked from the rain, and one hand trembled against the blanket covering him. The trauma team surrounded the stretcher. Dr. Cole moved to the patient's head while Mara stayed near the medication station. She listened. Not to the shouting. Not to the alarms. To the patient's breathing. There was something wrong with the rhythm. She looked at the monitor, then at the man's pupils, then at the medication list the paramedic had handed over. One drug caught her attention. She looked toward Dr. Cole. He was already preparing an order. Mara hesitated. Interns were not supposed to interrupt a chief surgeon during a critical procedure. She knew that. But she also knew what she was seeing. "Doctor," she said quietly. He ignored her. She tried again. "Doctor, his pressure is falling." Dr. Cole continued giving instructions. Mara looked at the medication syringe in the nurse's hand. Then she spoke louder. "He may be reacting to the medication." The room seemed to pause. Dr. Cole turned. "What did you say?" Mara pointed toward the chart. "He received a dose before transport. His rhythm changed afterward. I think we should stop and reassess before giving anything else." One of the senior nurses looked at Mara as though she had crossed an invisible line. Dr. Cole took the chart from her hand. His eyes moved across the page. Then back to the monitor. The patient's numbers shifted again. Mara watched his face. For the first time that morning, the chief surgeon was not looking at her prosthetic. He was looking at her. "Hold the medication," he ordered. The nurse stopped. Seconds later, the patient's condition began to stabilize. No one celebrated. In emergency medicine, a good decision often looked like nothing happening at all. Dr. Cole handed the chart back. "How did you notice that?" Mara said she had seen the pattern before. "Where?" She did not answer immediately. Before she could, another alarm sounded from the opposite side of the room. A young woman had arrived with severe injuries from the highway collision. The team rushed toward her, leaving the conversation unfinished. Mara followed. This time nobody told her to stay behind. The patient was pale and barely responsive. Her blood pressure was dropping rapidly. Dr. Cole examined her and began issuing orders. Mara stood at the bedside, watching the monitor. She noticed something that made her stomach tighten. The patient's pulse was changing in a pattern she recognized from an old trauma protocol she had studied hundreds of times. She reached for the equipment tray. One of the senior nurses stopped her. "Wait." Mara looked at the patient. Then at Dr. Cole. Something about the girl's breathing reminded her of another night, another hospital, another room where fluorescent lights had blurred into white streaks above her. She pushed the memory away. Not now. She passed the correct instrument to the physician and quietly suggested the next step. Dr. Cole followed it. The room moved faster. Orders became sharper. The patient was stabilized enough to be transferred. Only after the doors closed did Mara realize her hands were trembling. She turned toward the sink and washed them under cold water until the shaking stopped. Dr. Cole appeared behind her. "You have done this before," he said. Mara kept her eyes on the water. "I have studied emergency medicine." "That was not what I asked." She dried her hands. "You are an intern. You recognized two things today that several experienced staff members missed." He stepped closer. "Your chart says you completed your undergraduate nursing degree 3 years ago. It does not explain where you learned those trauma responses." Mara said nothing. Dr. Cole's gaze dropped briefly toward her right leg. He noticed the faint outline beneath her scrubs where the prosthetic met the fabric. "When did you lose your leg?" Mara's expression changed. That question was different. Personal. She answered quietly that it had been 8 years ago. "Accident?" "Yes." Dr. Cole waited. She expected another question, but none came. Then his face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for Mara to notice. His eyes moved toward the trauma bay doors as though he had suddenly remembered a room that no longer existed. 8 years ago, he said. "Which hospital?" Mara looked at him. "St. Vincent." Dr. Cole went completely still. The noise of the emergency department continued around them, but for a moment neither seemed to hear it. "St. Vincent," he repeated. Mara nodded. "Why?" He did not answer. Instead, he looked at the scar beneath her sleeve, then at the notebook in her hand. "What was the name of the surgeon who treated you?" Mara lowered her eyes. She had not spoken that name in years. "Dr. Elias Cole." The chief surgeon's face drained of color. Mara noticed. She had never seen fear on the face of a man like him. But there it was. Quiet. Unmistakable. And when Dr. Adrian Cole finally looked back at her, the question in his eyes was no longer about whether she belonged in the emergency room. It was about whether the young woman standing before him had any idea who had actually saved her life 8 years ago. Dr. Adrian Cole did not move for several seconds after hearing the name Elias Cole, and Mara noticed the change before anyone else in the emergency department did. The chief surgeon who had moments earlier been commanding an entire trauma team now stood beside the sink with one hand resting against the counter, staring at nothing. Mara had expected questions, perhaps an explanation, but instead he told her to return to the floor. She did. Yet something had shifted. The room that had felt like a place where she constantly had to prove herself now felt strangely unfamiliar, as though a door had opened somewhere behind the walls and she had accidentally stepped through it. For the next hour, Dr. Cole watched her without speaking. He saw how she moved around patients, how she checked on frightened families without being asked, how she remembered small details other staff overlooked. He also noticed the way she protected her right leg whenever she thought nobody was watching. Eventually he pulled her personnel file. The accident date was exactly 8 years old. The hospital listed in the old records was St. Vincent. The attending surgeon on the emergency report was Elias Cole. Adrian closed the file. His father had died 7 years earlier. He had spent years believing his father had left behind nothing but a reputation and a collection of difficult memories. But one name in Mara's record unsettled everything. Elias Cole had not been working alone that night. Adrian remembered the disaster. A highway bridge collapsed during a violent storm. Dozens of injured people. Overwhelmed emergency rooms. His father had operated for hours without stopping. Adrian had been a junior resident then, still learning, still desperate to become the kind of surgeon his father was. He remembered one patient in particular, a teenage girl who had arrived with catastrophic injuries and almost no chance of survival. But the memory was incomplete. He remembered blood-soaked clothing. He remembered a frightened mother. He remembered his father ordering everyone to keep working. Then there was a blank space in his memory, a gap created by exhaustion and grief that he had never tried to fill. Mara was standing in that missing space. Before Adrian could ask another question, an alarm sounded. A new patient was rushed through the doors. A construction worker had been trapped beneath falling debris. His condition deteriorated almost immediately. The senior team gathered around him. Dr. Cole began issuing orders, but the room was already crowded and confused. Someone called for blood. Another nurse searched for a line. A physician reached for medication. Mara saw the problem before anyone else did. The man's chart showed a severe allergy to one of the medications being prepared. She stepped forward. "Stop." Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. The nurse froze. Mara pointed to the chart. "He is allergic." Dr. Cole looked at the medication. Then at Mara. "Change it." The team moved again. The patient survived the first crisis, but his condition remained unstable. Dr. Cole turned toward Mara. "Stay with him." Mara nodded. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. The emergency room became a blur of movement. Patients arrived. Others were transferred. Rain continued striking the windows. Mara remained beside the injured worker, speaking softly whenever he opened his eyes. She did not know that Dr. Cole was watching from across the room. He was no longer trying to decide whether she belonged there. He was trying to understand why she seemed so determined to carry every burden without asking anyone for help. Near midnight, the emergency department finally quieted. The monitors still sounded. The lights still hummed. But the shouting had stopped. Mara sat alone in an empty treatment bay, rubbing the side of her prosthetic where the pressure had become painful. Dr. Cole entered and closed the curtain behind him. He placed a folder on the chair. Mara looked at it. It was old. The paper edges were yellowed. She knew immediately what it was. Her hospital record. "I found the original report," he said. Mara did not touch it. "Why?" "Because there is something you deserve to know." She waited. Dr. Cole sat across from her. 8 years ago, my father was the surgeon who treated you." Mara looked down. "I know." "No," Adrian said. "You know his name. You do not know what happened that night." Mara's jaw tightened. She had spent years trying not to remember. She remembered waking in a hospital bed. She remembered pain. She remembered her mother crying. She remembered being told that her leg could not be saved. She remembered a doctor sitting beside her after everyone else had left. She remembered a voice telling her that losing part of her body did not mean losing the rest of her life. But she had never seen the doctor's face clearly. She had been heavily medicated. Adrian opened the folder. "My father wrote something in your file that was never included in the final discharge report. He said you were asking questions even while you were critically injured. You wanted to know why the nurses kept checking your hands. You wanted to know how they knew when you were getting worse. You were already studying them." Mara stared at him. She had no memory of that. Adrian continued. "He wrote that you told him you wanted to become a nurse someday." Mara's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. "I was 16, she whispered. "He remembered you. Then why did he never contact me?" Adrian looked down at the folder. "Because he believed you needed to build a life that was not tied to the worst night of your life." Mara said nothing. The room became very still. Adrian reached into the folder and removed a final page. There is more. Mara looked at him. His father had written that another doctor had made a decision that night. A decision that almost cost Mara her life. Adrian's expression hardened. That doctor was me. Mara stopped breathing for a moment. She remembered a young resident standing beside her bed. She remembered someone saying the wrong medication had almost been given. She remembered her father screaming at someone in the hallway. But she had never known the young resident's name. Adrian told her that he had made a mistake during the chaos of the disaster. His father had caught it before it became fatal. Instead of destroying Adrian's career, Elias had taken responsibility for the confusion and protected his son. Mara looked at the man sitting across from her. The surgeon who had humiliated her that morning was the same young doctor who had once stood outside her operating room, believing he had nearly killed her. But Adrian had not finished. He told her there was one final thing his father had written. Mara's hands trembled as she read the line. It said that if the girl ever returned to medicine, she should never be treated as a patient who survived. She should be treated as a professional who had learned how precious every second could become. Mara looked up. Adrian's eyes were wet. I spent 8 years thinking that night was something I had to forget, he said. But you spent 8 years turning it into something useful. Mara closed the folder. Then another nurse entered the room with a new chart. A critical patient had arrived. Adrian stood immediately. Mara followed. But before they reached the trauma bay, he stopped. Mara, he said, I need you to tell me something. She turned. Did you choose emergency nursing because of what happened to you? Mara looked through the glass toward the frightened family waiting outside. Then she answered with the truth she had never told anyone. No. I chose it because of what the nurses did after it happened. Adrian stared at her. She continued quietly. They never looked at what I had lost. They looked at what I still had. The doors to the trauma room opened. A stretcher rolled past them. Adrian looked at Mara differently now. Not as an intern. Not as a patient from an old file. As someone who had carried a lesson he had spent 8 years trying to escape. And then the monitor inside the trauma bay began to alarm. The new patient's condition was collapsing. Mara looked at the screen and recognized the pattern instantly. Adrian saw her expression. What is it? She whispered the answer. The same complication from 8 years ago. Adrian's face went pale. Because suddenly he understood that Mara had not merely returned to the hospital where her life had changed. She had returned to the exact kind of emergency that had once taken her leg. And this time, she was the person standing closest to the patient who needed someone to remember what everyone else had forgotten. The monitor screamed before anyone in the trauma room understood what was happening, and Mara Ellis was already moving. The patient's condition was deteriorating in a pattern she recognized from the old case buried in the hospital archives, the same dangerous sequence that had once surrounded her own survival. Dr. Adrian Cole stood beside her, but this time he did not issue an order to step aside. He looked at Mara and simply asked what she saw. She answered calmly, and the team listened. The room moved with purpose. Every decision came from experience, training, and the refusal to let panic become another medical error. Mara noticed a subtle change in the patient's breathing and directed the nurse toward the correct intervention. Dr. Cole confirmed it. Within minutes, the patient's numbers began to stabilize. Nobody applauded. Nobody called Mara a hero. The team simply kept working, because that was what mattered. When the patient was finally transferred, Mara stepped into the hallway and leaned against the wall. Her hands were shaking. Dr. Cole found her there. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he held out an old photograph. Mara looked at it and froze. It showed a younger Elias Cole standing beside a hospital bed. Beside him stood a 16-year-old girl with bandages covering most of her body. Mara recognized herself. But there was something she had never remembered. The young doctor standing near the bed was Adrian. He looked exhausted, frightened, and barely older than a student. Mara stared at the photograph for a long time. You were there, she said. Adrian nodded. I was there. You made a mistake. I did, And your father saved me. Adrian lowered his eyes. He saved you too. Mara looked at the photograph again. For years she had imagined her survival as a chain of strangers who had passed through her life and disappeared. Now she understood that those people had carried pieces of the night with them. Her mother had carried fear. The nurses had carried compassion. Elias Cole had carried responsibility. Adrian had carried guilt. And Mara had carried all of it without knowing their names. She asked why Adrian had treated her so harshly that morning. He answered honestly. Because when I saw you struggling with your prosthetic, I saw the girl from that night before I saw the nurse you had become. The admission hurt more than an accusation would have. Mara looked at him. You thought I was weak. I thought I was protecting the department from another mistake. He paused. But I was wrong. The hallway grew quiet around them. Mara could have demanded an apology. She could have reminded him of every careless glance, every assumption, every moment when someone had treated her prosthetic as proof that she did not belong. Instead, she asked him a different question. What would your father have wanted you to do? Adrian looked toward the old photograph. He answered that his father would have told him to stop protecting his pride and start protecting the people in front of him. Mara nodded. Then she returned the photograph. Keep it, she said. You need it more than I do. Adrian looked surprised. She explained that she had spent years believing she needed to remember the worst night of her life in order to justify why she became a nurse. She no longer believed that. She did not need to prove that her pain had produced something valuable. She simply needed to keep doing the work. Later that morning, the hospital director called Mara into his office. Adrian was there. So was the nursing supervisor. Mara expected another evaluation, another discussion about whether she could safely handle emergency work. Instead, the director offered her a permanent position in the trauma department after her internship. Mara stared at the paperwork. She asked whether this was because of what had happened. Adrian shook his head. It is because you earned it. Those words landed differently than praise. They carried no pity. No special allowance. No hidden apology. Just recognition. Mara signed the papers. When she walked back into the emergency department, the same floor that had felt hostile the day before seemed almost unchanged. The same monitors beeped. The same carts rolled past. The same fluorescent lights reflected against the polished floor. But Mara was different. Not because her prosthetic had disappeared. Not because the scars had faded. She was different because she no longer believed she had to make herself smaller to reassure people who were uncomfortable with what they could not understand. Dr. Cole watched her from the nurse's station. When another emergency call came, Mara moved toward the trauma bay. Her prosthetic made the familiar quiet sound against the floor. This time, nobody stared. Years earlier, people had looked at her body and seen what she had lost. Now they looked at her hands and saw what she could give. That was the real turning point. Not the photograph. Not the revelation. Not the position waiting on her desk. The turning point was the moment Mara realized that survival was not an obligation to remain grateful for being alive. It was permission to become fully alive. And sometimes the person who seems to need the most help is the person who has spent years quietly helping everyone else. Mara never forgot the lesson. Neither did Adrian. He eventually placed his father's old photograph in the staff room, not as a monument to a famous surgeon, but as a reminder of what medicine was supposed to be when fear and pride were stripped away. Beneath it, he wrote a single sentence for every new nurse and doctor who entered the department. See the person before you see the problem. Mara saw those words one evening after a difficult shift and smiled. She knew exactly why they mattered. Because 8 years earlier, she had entered that same hospital as a frightened teenager whose future seemed to have been reduced to a hospital bed and a missing leg. She had left as someone who understood that a life could be changed without being destroyed. And years later, when another young intern stumbled briefly while carrying supplies, Mara was the first person to reach out. She did not ask whether the intern needed special treatment. She asked whether she was all right. Then she picked up the supplies scattered across the floor and walked beside her back toward the trauma bay. That was how Mara chose to honor the people who had saved her. Not with statues. Not with speeches. With attention. With patience. With the simple refusal to let another human being feel invisible. Because the deepest kindness is rarely loud enough to make the news. Sometimes it is only a hand reaching down before someone has to ask for it. Sometimes it is a doctor choosing humility after years of carrying guilt. Sometimes it is a nurse walking through the same doors where her life once changed, carrying not bitterness but purpose. And sometimes the greatest proof that a person has healed is not that they have forgotten what happened, but that they can remember it without allowing it to decide who they become. If this story reminded you of someone who kept going when the world underestimated them, share it with them, because a small reminder at the right moment can matter more than we ever know. And long after the emergency room fell quiet that night, Mara's footsteps continued down the hallway, steady and unmistakable, carrying her toward the next patient who needed to be seen.